The snow came sideways that morning, the kind that didn't fall so much as it flung itself at anything still standing. Lena had been standing for 3 hours. Her boots had stopped keeping the wet out somewhere around the 2nd hour. She knew this because she couldn't feel her left foot anymore. Not pain, not pressure, nothing. Just the idea of a foot at the end of her leg, somewhere down there in the grey slush. The general store had locked its door at noon. The man inside, round face, small eyes behind wire spectacles, had turned the sign without looking at her. She'd pressed her palm flat against the glass. He hadn't looked up from his ledger. That was 40 minutes ago. Maybe longer. Time moved strangely when the cold got serious. She had $3.11 in the pocket of her coat. The coat had belonged to her mother, who had been smaller than Lena, and the sleeve stopped 2 inches short of her wrists. The wind found those 2 inches every time. It always found them. There was nowhere left to go. She'd told herself that before, twice in the last year, and both times she'd been wrong. There had been somewhere. Her cousin's spare room in Dalton, then the back of the laundry in Crestfork where Mrs. Haverfield had let her sleep on a cot behind the drying racks. But Mrs. Haverfield had sold the laundry in October, and her cousin had married a man who didn't want extra people in the house, and had said so plainly. And Lena had left before she was asked twice. Now it was December, and she was in a town's she'd arrived in 4 days ago by stage, looking for work that turned out not to exist, and the boarding house had given her notice this morning because she was 2 days behind on the room. She'd packed her bag in 20 minutes. Everything she owned fit into one canvas bag, with a broken brass buckle that she held shut with her hand. She was holding it now. The wagon was the first thing she heard. The creak of wheels on packed snow, the slow, heavy knock of hooves. She stepped back against the building, without thinking, the way a person steps back from any large thing, moving through a narrow space. It was a draft horse, pulling a flatbed wagon, loaded with timber and burlap sacks. The man driving it wore a coat that might have once been brown and a hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see much of his face. Big hands on the reins. That was what she noticed first. Hands like they'd been built for a different scale of work than most men did. He pulled the horse up even with her, and stopped. She didn't say anything, neither did he for a moment. Then, "You waiting on someone?" His voice was low, not unkind, the kind of voice that didn't waste movement. "No," she said. He looked at her, really looked, the way people mostly didn't anymore. Not at her face so much as at all of her, the short sleeves, the bag she was clutching, the way she was standing with her weight shifted to her right foot because her left one had gone wrong. "Your foot hurt." "It's cold," she said. "I can't feel it much." He was quiet again. The horse shifted, blowing steam from its nose. Snow collected on the brim of the man's hat, and he didn't brush it off. "I'm going up the North Ridge," he said. "If you need out of the weather." She looked at him. He was watching the street ahead of him, not her, which was either worse or better. She couldn't decide. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. That was all he said. No reassurance, no persuasion. Just the acknowledgement, plain and even, like a fact about the weather. She looked down the street. The general store sign still said closed. The wind had picked up again, rattling the wooden boards above the dry goods shop across the way. There was no one else on the street. She picked up her bag and climbed up onto the bench beside him. He didn't say anything. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved. His name was Weston. He offered it about a mile out of town, when the road curved north and the trees closed in around them, heavy with snow. She told him hers. "Lena." He nodded once, like he was filing it somewhere. She sat with her bag on her lap and watched the road come toward them. The trees here were old pines, their branches bent low under the weight of the winter. It was quieter than town had been, which was saying something. Because town had been quiet enough. Up here the snow muffled everything. The horse's footfalls sounded far away. Her foot had started to ache, which she understood was a better sign than not aching, but it didn't feel like a better sign. It felt like someone was pressing a hot coal through the sole of her boot. She didn't say anything about it. Weston drove with an economy of movement she found herself watching without meaning to. He didn't fidget. He didn't talk to fill the silence. He adjusted his grip on the reins once when the road bent around a drift, and that was all. The horse seemed to know what it was doing. "How far?" she asked after a while. "Another hour." He paused. "Maybe less. Road's better up past the creek crossing." She nodded. "You got family here?" he asked, not prying. It sounded like a practical question, the kind a person asked when they were trying to understand a situation that concerned them. "No," she said. "In the territory?" "No." He didn't ask anything else. The cold had gotten into her hands now. She tucked them under her bag, against her thighs, and tried to think about something other than the temperature. She thought about the spring, which felt impossible from inside a December like this one. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Ohio, the smell of it, wood smoke and dried herbs, and something sweet she'd never been able to name. That kitchen had been sold years ago along with everything else. She'd stopped thinking about it for a long time. It surprised her that it was still in there somewhere, all of it, just waiting to be needed. The creek crossing was a low wooden bridge that the horse walked across without hesitation. On the other side, the road did get better. Or at least, more sheltered, the pines growing close on both sides, so the wind couldn't get the same purchase on them. She was starting to shiver and couldn't stop it. Weston reached behind the bench and pulled out a canvas roll and handed it to her, without looking at her. She unrolled it. A heavy wool blanket, smelling of horse and wood smoke, and something sharp she couldn't identify. She put it around her shoulders and pulled it tight. "Thank you," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The cabin sat in a clearing at the end of a path that branched off the main road. It was plain. Chinked log walls, a stone chimney, one window on the south side. A lean-to stable attached to the left, where she could hear something moving and breathing in the dark. He stopped the wagon at the edge of the clearing. "Stay up," he said to her. Not a question. He got down from the bench and led the horse around to the stable, and she sat on the wagon and listened to him work. She couldn't see him clearly in the low afternoon light, but she could hear him. The traces unbuckled, the harness lifted away piece by piece, the horse moving into its stall, the chunk of a feed bucket being set down. Straw rustled. He was talking to the horse, too softly for her to make out words, just the low cadence of it. He came back out and went to the rear of the wagon and began moving the burlap sacks under the lean-to overhang, where the snow couldn't reach them. She climbed down to help, and he looked at her. "I can carry," she said. He passed her a sack without argument. It was heavy. Grain, she thought, from the way it shifted. She carried it to where he was stacking, and came back for another. They unloaded in silence, which felt different from the silence in the wagon. That had been a stranger's silence. This was something more like a working quiet, two people doing a task together without needing to discuss it. When the wagon was unloaded, he covered it with a heavy tarpaulin and tied it down. "Come in," he said. Inside, the cabin was cold, but not as cold as outside. The walls kept the wind out, and that was half the battle. A stone fireplace took up most of the north wall, a wood stove in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, a cot against the east wall with a thick wool blanket folded on it, a loft overhead she couldn't see into, a shelf of supplies, tins, a flour sack, dried meat hanging on hooks, a coat on a peg by the door, a rifle over the door, and another leaning in the corner. Weston crouched at the fireplace and began building a fire without ceremony, laying kindling in a precise pattern she could tell he'd done 10,000 times. She stood near the door, still holding her bag. "Sit," he said, gesturing at the nearer chair without turning around. She sat. The fire caught. He added a larger piece of wood, then another, watching the flame like it might change its mind. When he was satisfied, he stood and moved to the wood stove, and opened the firebox and did the same thing there. The cold began to ease by degrees. It was not fast, it was never fast, but it was coming. He pulled a pot from the shelf and filled it from a water barrel near the door, set it on the stove. Then he moved to the supply shelf and took down a tin of dried beans, dried beef wrapped in cloth, and a small crock she couldn't identify. He looked at the beans for a moment. Beans need soaking, he said to himself mostly. He put the tin back, took down dried beef instead, flour, a twist of salt. His hands moved like a man who cooked alone and had made peace with it. Lena pulled off her left boot. Her stocking was wet through, and when she peeled it off, she could see. Her toes were white at the tips, with a red border creeping up from the cold. Not the worst she'd seen. She'd seen real frostbite once, on a man in Crest Fork who'd lost 2 fingers. But not nothing. Either. She set her stocking to dry near the fire. Weston had his back to her. He was slicing the dried beef into a skillet with a large knife, and she watched him a moment before she spoke. "My toes are white," she said. He turned and looked, and his expression didn't change much, but something in his face went very still and careful. He went to a small chest by the cot and opened it, and came back with a cloth and a tin of something that smelled like pine and lanolin. He set them on the hearth near her feet. "Rub them," he said. "Slow, don't rush it." He went back to the stove. She rubbed. It hurt. A deep, specific hurt, the kind that meant the blood was coming back. She did it slow, like he said. And after a while her toes started to look pink again at the borders. And she kept going. The smell of beef in the skillet filled the cabin. He added something from the crock. She still couldn't see what, and the smell changed to something richer. He made a simple pan gravy with flour and the drippings, slow, stirring without looking, like his hands knew what to do, without being supervised. The fire popped, the stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. She thought about what she'd thought on the wagon bench, about Ted Bundy, about the man in Crest Fork who'd offered her a room and then shown her what kind of room he meant, about the way she'd learned to read a person's stillness, whether it was the stillness of a man who had nothing to hide, or the stillness of a man who was waiting. Weston's stillness, she decided, was not the waiting kind. She wasn't entirely sure how she knew that, but she'd been reading people's stillness for a long time, and she thought she was right. She hoped she was right. He set a tin plate in front of her, with the beef and gravy and a wedge of cornbread he'd made in the skillet, while she wasn't paying close attention. Then he sat at the other chair, with his own plate, and they ate. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't look at her constantly, the way some men did, the way that felt like being measured. He ate. He looked at the fire. "It's good," she said. She meant it. "Salt helps," he said. She almost laughed. She didn't know why. When they'd finished, he took the plates to the water barrel and rinsed them and set them on the shelf. Then he stood at the window for a moment, looking at nothing she could see in the dark glass. "Storm's setting in for real," he said. "Shouldn't travel tonight." "I know," she said. "You can have the cot." She looked at it. "Where will you sleep?" He glanced up at the loft. "I'll be fine." She looked at the loft, too. The ladder was narrow and steep. "That's your bed," she said. "I've slept in worse." "So have I," she said. "I'll take the loft. I'm smaller. The ladder won't trouble me." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him weighing something. "Cot's warmer," he said finally, being closer to the stove. "Then give me one of those blankets, and I'll be fine," she said. "I'm not putting you out of your own bed." He didn't argue further. He pulled 2 extra blankets from the chest by the cot and handed them to her, and she tucked them under her arm and climbed the ladder. The loft was low-ceilinged, barely enough to sit up in, but it was dry and warmer than she'd expected, heat rising from the stove below. A straw tick mattress, thin but present. She spread the blankets out and lay down in her clothes, her damp boot standing upright at the top of the ladder to dry. Below her, she heard him bank the stove for the night, the sound of a chair dragged, the creak of the cot. Then quiet. She stared at the sloped ceiling 2 feet above her face. The wind outside had gotten serious now. She could hear it pressing against the walls. Looking for gaps, the cabin held. She thought about the boarding house, the 2 days she owed. She thought about the general store man with his small eyes who hadn't looked up. She thought about Weston slicing beef at the stove, the matter-of-fact precision of it, the way he'd handed her the blanket on the wagon without preamble or expectation. She didn't know what tomorrow looked like. She didn't know what she was supposed to do with the $3.11, but she was warm, and her toes were pink again, and the walls were holding. She slept. In the morning the storm had passed, and the world outside the cabin window was white and absolute, the kind of morning that made distances impossible to judge. The trees along the clearing edge looked painted. Weston was already up. She could smell coffee, which she hadn't expected. And when she climbed down the ladder, he was standing at the stove with his back to her, and there was a second tin cup on the table. She sat down. He poured coffee into the cup and set it in front of her, and sat across from her with his own. It was strong enough to feel like a decision. "Storm put another foot on top," he said. "Road's not passable for a day at least." She held the cup with both hands. "I can work," she said, "while I'm here, whatever needs doing." He looked at her over his cup. "Can you cook?" "Yes. Firewood needs splitting." "I can do that. I'll do the splitting," he said. "You do the stacking." It was the closest thing to an argument he seemed capable of having. They spent the morning that way. He split and she stacked, and neither of them said much, and it was not uncomfortable. She learned the rhythm of it, the thwack of the axe, the pause, the clunk of wood on the growing pile. She learned which pieces fit together best and how to stack them so they wouldn't shift. She hadn't known she knew how to do that. It turned out she did. At noon he came inside and made salt pork and boiled potatoes and more cornbread, and she washed the dishes after, and neither of them made a ceremony of any of it. In the afternoon he went out to check the horse and the wagon road, and she found a broom behind the door and swept the cabin floor, which needed it. She didn't know why she did it. She just did. When he came back in, he looked at the floor. "Road's still bad," he said. "Tomorrow maybe," she said. "Maybe." He sat down and took a piece of leather from a saddlebag near the door and began to mend it. She sat in the other chair and looked at her hands. "I'm not usually like this," she said, after a while. He looked up. "Like what?" "This," she gestured vaguely, without a plan. He looked back at the leather. "Most people are sometimes. I had a plan in October," she said. "Then it changed. What was it?" She thought about whether to answer. "Work at the laundry in Crest Fork through winter. Save enough to get to my sister in Oregon in the spring. She's got land. Her husband's decent. What changed it?" "The laundry sold." She paused. "And then some other things." He nodded. He didn't ask about the other things. "Oregon's not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him. It was such a plain thing to say. It was so completely obvious, and it hadn't occurred to her once in 2 months. "No," she said. "I guess it's not." She stayed 3 days in the end. The road opened on the second day, but by then she was useful, and neither of them seemed to feel any urgency about it. On the second afternoon, she found needle and thread in the chest, and repaired a tear in the shoulder of his second coat that he seemed not to have noticed. She set it on the table when she was done. He looked at it when he came in from outside, and then at her, and the look was brief and not elaborate, but it landed somewhere. On the third morning she cooked breakfast. Eggs from 3 hens he'd failed to mention lived in the lean-to alongside the horse, and he ate them without comment, which she was beginning to understand was his version of approval. After breakfast, she washed the dishes and put her coat on, and carried her bag to the door. He was at the table, turning his cup in his hands. "Stage runs through Millhaven on Thursdays," he said. "That's 12 miles north. I pass through it on supply runs. When's your next run?" "Could be Thursday." He paused. "Could be later in the week." She looked at him. He was looking at the cup. "I could use help," he said, "with the supply runs, keeping things sorted, the record keeping." He turned the cup once more. I'm not good with the writing of it. She understood that this was not a simple thing for him to say. She could hear the effort in the plainness of it. What would that look like? She said carefully. Room and board, he said. Fair share of anything the trapping brings in, come spring. He looked up then, finally, and met her eyes. You go to Oregon when you're ready to go. That doesn't change. But the road opens again in April. She thought about April. She thought about her sister's land, which she'd never seen. She thought about Oregon being where it had always been. She set her bag down. I'd want to write to my sister, she said. Let her know where I am. Millhaven's got a post, he said. I'd want it clear, she said. What this is and what it isn't. He met her eyes. It's work, he said. Nothing else unless you say so. She stood there a moment with her hand still on the strap of her bag. Outside the window, the morning sun was doing something extraordinary to the snow on the pine branches, lighting it up from inside, so that the whole tree line seemed to glow. She'd been looking at that window for 3 days, and she hadn't seen it do that before. All right, she said. He nodded once. He stood up and picked up his coat and shrugged it on. The mended one, she noticed. He'd chosen the mended one. I'll hitch up, he said. Millhaven's got a post and a decent supply of flour. We can go today if you want to send that letter. She picked up her bag and followed him out into the cold white morning, and the door swung shut behind them, and the pines stood luminous and still on all sides, and the road north was clear.